Back to school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop tax-free August 2nd through 6th and save up to 70% off the latest school styles. The best of apparel, footwear, accessories, and more. Save at Nike Factory Store, American Eagle, Gap Outlet, Crocs, Under Armour, Banana Republic Factory, and hundreds more. There's always something happening. Discover the latest fun and events all season long. Tanger Outlets, your savings destination.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By honoring your sacred vocation of business, you impact your family, your friends, and your community. At Grand Canyon University, our MBA degree program is 100% online, with emphases in business analytics and finance to help you reach your goals. Find your purpose at GCU. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Welcome back to Die Hard on a Blank, the podcast where we explore the influence of Die Hard on action cinema, one action movie at a time. I'm Liam Billingham, and with me is my buckaroo, Phil Gawthorne.
Hello.
How are you, Phil?
I'm terrific.
How'd you get here today? Did you get here by your car, by submarine, by cargo plane?
I was tempted to take the sub from Glendale to West Hollywood, but in the end I decided to. I took the car, but I was blasting Basil Polidorus' soundtrack to this movie.
It's pretty wild that you put the Caterpillar drive in your car so that you can
stealth purposes through LA traffic.
Yeah, it's pretty. I don't know if that would go over well. All of these references to Caterpillar drives and submarines is because today's film is, Phil,
The Hunt for Red October.
Or Die Hard on a Submarine.
Yeah.
Where are you on submarine movies?
So, love a submarine. Mine's parked in the garage.
And mode of transportation.
Yeah. I'm more of a helicopter guy. I know you're more of a submarine guy. This movie has both, so we're both in hog heaven.
It's a beautiful thing. You're in the air. I'm in the sea. We can come together
and
invite a small island. The Hunt for Red October. I'm a huge submarine guy. This is one of my favorites. The Hunt for Red October. Let's give the people a few facts. Should we give the people a few facts? The Hunt for Red October is an espionage action thriller that was released by Paramount in the U.S. on March 2nd, 1990. Interesting to think of it as an espionage action thriller, considering the pedigree of the people in it. But I would never think of it as a spy movie. That's a side note, though.
Yeah. But technically it is. But yeah, we think it's a submarine movie, it's an action movie, it's a spy movie. But I think it's definitely in the espionage realm.
Absolutely. It was directed by the great John McTiernan and produced by Mace Newfield. It stars Sean Connery. You have to pause before the name. A moment before the name.
Indeed. A moment of reverence.
Peace. One of the greats. Alec Baldwin, Scott Glenn, James Earl Jones, Sam Neill. And I have to say it because the hero of the movie is the sound guy, Courtney Vance. Yeah, as Seaman Jones.
It just keeps going, this cast list.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
Tim Curry.
Murderer's row of
It's
talent.
incredible.
Yeah.
Joss Ackland.
Yep.
Diplomatic immunity.
Last time I blew the mic out when I said that. So I'm resisting with every bone in my body to not scream diplomatic immunity in a South African accent.
Wait, no, do one. Move away from the mic. Just do one.
Diplomatic immunity.
Amazing.
I'm improving my mic technique.
I think we have to do a radio play of Lethal Weapon 2. Do me a favor.
The stage version of Lethal Weapon. Let's make it happen.
It seems like a Rushmore thing. The screenplay. Well, let's start with the literary reference. This film is based on a novel by Tom Clancy. Your dad, my dad, everybody's favorite dad author in the 90s. The screenplay is by Larry Ferguson and Donald E. Stewart. It was edited by Dennis Verkley and John Wright. The composer is the great Basil Polidorus. What? Can you name offhand a couple other films that he composed for?
RoboCop and Starship Troopers, I believe.
Whoa, I didn't know he was a Verhoeven guy.
Yeah, I believe so.
Have we talked about Starship Troopers?
No, we've not.
One of the great movies.
Yeah,
obsessed.
I have a pretty interesting take on Starship Troopers because at one point I was actually exploring I was asked about doing a remake of it. So I went on a super, super, super deep dive into Starship Troopers, read the book, studied it a lot. Absolutely love it. Interesting comparison piece to this in terms of the militarism and what have you, but probably a conversation for another day.
Yeah, it's one of the great subversive movies, I think, on some level. I think it's absolutely
possibly
amazing.
The greatest.
I would, yeah, it's up there. But enough. We could listen to it on Troopcast, our Starship Troopers podcast. The Hunt for Red October was made on an estimated budget of $30 million. Looks it like it looks incredible. Like it's just an incredible movie, and it grossed $200 million. Phil, this podcast is about Die Hard.
Yes.
But also sort of about The Hunt for Red October.
Yes.
So why don't you give us a little bit on what the sort of commonalities, what's the Die Hard DNA in the
if
Hunt
you
for
will,
Red October?
Die Hard DNA
If you
of this
will,
film. Yes.
Die Hard DNA.
It's time for Die Hard DNA.
With your host, Phil Gawthorne.
So, obviously, the main one being director John McTiernan. This is the movie that he made at the expense of making Die Hard 2, which he was offered but did not want to.
Do you know why is there any text about why?
I actually read a quote that basically said he didn't really like the way that McClane was sort of becoming a superhero. It was less grounded than the original movie, but of course he would come back for the third installment, Die Hard with a Vengeance. So we have director John McTiernan, we have cinematographer Jan de Bont,
who would go on, a legend who would go on to make one of the great Die Hard follow-ups.
Of course, his directorial debut, Speed, that we're rattling towards. Yeah, we're very excited about that.
Can you imagine if your first movie was Speed?
Yeah, by the way, I'll just rip off this classic, no biggie.
And also, in some ways, make as good of a movie.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
He was also Paul Verhoeven's cinematographer.
Yep.
So
Verhoeven has a sort of peripheral influence across this whole pod.
Yeah.
So, he's always in the ether.
Verhoeven podcast?
Absolutely.
The dream.
Sign me up.
I know.
After we do Iguana Pod, that I still want to, Robert Davies, Iguana, let's get into it.
Iguana stuff.
That's a License to Kill reference, by the way. For
listen to the previous episode if you haven't already.
So we also have a couple of Die Hard's cast members. We have actors Anthony Peck, who plays Al Powell's, he's credited as young cop in Die Hard. But he also is interesting in the Die Hard mythology because he plays two different characters in two different Die Hard movies. Ricky Walsh, he plays a detective called Ricky Walsh in Die Hard with a Vengeance. He plays Lieutenant Commander Thompson here, who's Scott Glenn's number 2 on
He's
the
great.
USS
Makes
Dallas.
a strong
Terrific.
impression in this movie.
He's a big McTiernan guy in all his movies, almost all of them. And Rick Ducommun, who plays the city worker who turns on the power in Die Hard at Robert Davies' request. And plays the worst guy to be in a plane with ever when you're airsick.
So funny,
as the navigator who is telling the stories about puke and.
He's a big McTiernan guy too, right?
Well, I know he's definitely been at least 2. I'm not sure if he's been.
He's been in like almost.
Maybe
he was in a lot of them,
Very
and he passed
possibly.
away sadly. So
he did passed away young. Always a delightful presence on screen. And then we'll get into this in a bit more detail later, but we also have intense cat and mouse dynamics in a confined space. We have an everyman/family man hero thrust unexpectedly into a dangerous situation, a hero who hates air travel and is partial to soliloquies, a cuddly bear on the plane that the hero intends to give to his daughter at the end, and an operatic soundtrack featuring a lot of choir music. One of the other interesting pieces of Die Hard DNA, which is a little bit more subtle, I think, is the realistic approach to action that this film embraces. And I place that in context against, say, something like Commando, a previous Joel Silver movie from the mid-'80s, or the later Rambo movies around this time that were not necessarily grounded in real-world even physics to some extent necessarily. So I think the grounded tonal approach and the realism of this film is significant in the action movie tradition.
And one of the things that makes it very, very appealing to me. I just love the realism of it.
Yeah, there's some very interesting Die Hard DNA in here.
The thing that I think was most interesting in your Die Hard DNA there is the fact that McTiernan passed on Die Hard 2. Because I think I like Die Hard 2.
I love Die Hard 2.
But I think it's pretty classy to be like, I don't need to revisit this, despite probably them being like, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching.
Oh, yeah, the money truck was backed up.
Oh, I'm sure the money was crazy. And he's but he's, again, this bit of this Renaissance guy, I think, who likes to do different things and is like I can't imagine him in the landscape, the franchise landscape, very strongly. I see him sort of being like, no, I want to make original movies a little bit, even though he launched a great franchise.
Well, I think it's interesting with the McTiernan of it all because I actually watched his first movie this week, which is called Nomad, starring Pierce Brosnan, and is a really weird horror mystery thriller that he actually wrote. That got him Predator. One of 3 back-to-back masterpieces, I would say, and certainly in the action genre: Predator, Die Hard, Hunt for Red October. Then he makes a movie that we kind of forget, Medicine Man with Sean Connery.
I like Medicine Man.
It's not culturally. That was not a sentence I was expecting to hear today. But
I haven't seen it in 25 years, but I liked it when I was 15.
To your point, again, off the beaten track, not an obvious choice. From the director of Predator, Medicine Man.
Is Laura Dern in that?
Lorraine Bracco.
Is
the female lead.
Right.
Anyway, and then Last Action Hero. So I think he goes back to the Die Hard because it's a safe bet after the box office disappointment of Last Action Hero.
Which is a great movie.
Which we're going to get, which is a fascinating,
it's so good,
fascinating movie. But the point is that McTiernan made 3 back-to-back masterpieces, which, in my opinion, Predator, Die Hard, and this one in the action genre. So he's definitely doing different things. He's not sticking in a franchise at this point in his career, which is
that's
pretty
true.
brave. Yeah,
and then I would say that you could argue the stuff that follows Hunt for Red October is a little more experimental. Right, in terms of the Medicine Man. And Medicine Man is not like a down-the-line thriller. It has a little bit of that like Mosquito Coast DNA.
Right.
Good movie.
Yeah.
But like a little more, again, maybe not culturally sensitive, but like he was not making movies about cops anymore. And in fact, when he would return to that with Die with a Vengeance, but before that, Last Action Hero, I think, is a couple years before Die Hard with a Vengeance.
Yes.
Last Action Hero is like a very self-reflexive movie, obviously. So it's interesting where he kind of went with his career.
I can't wait for us to get into place Last Action Hero and all the Shakespeare and all of the meta elements of it in the wider context of McTiernan's
because he's a Shakespearean guy. If I may, can you indulge me?
Please.
Claudius, you killed my father. Big mistake.
This is what we do here. Schwarzenegger doing Shakespeare. That's the vibe
very
that we're...
classy pod. It's a classy pod. What's your relationship to this movie?
So my first memory of it were I guess I would have been 8 or 9 years old when but I actually do remember seeing the trailer and being like, and I was trying to work out, what movie would I have been watching? Because maybe I was trying to think, could it have been Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Because I remember going to see that.
Great movie.
Probably not, because the timings wouldn't work out. It doesn't really matter. But what I remember is I'm being exposed to a lot of kid-friendly, movies at that time. I'm pretty young, but I remember distinctly seeing this trailer, which I think is one of the most exciting trailers
I rewatched
ever.
it. It's really good.
The original trailer with the way it cuts between the action and a radar screen with the blip getting closer and closer to the center, which gives it this incredible sense of rhythm and propulsion, and it's just so exciting. And I remember just distinctly thinking, like, this film looks so exciting and realistic and just not different to what you were typically seeing. And we're kind of going to get into how this really created a sort of subgenre of the techno thriller.
Talk about the techno thriller.
Well, I mean, that's how Tom Clancy's novels were defined, and I would say, there's Michael Crichton to some extent. Have that essentially is very detail-oriented thriller stories that might be in the spy world or to some extent, perhaps science fiction, but generally like grounded, realistic stuff that is very focused on minutiae and accurate, detailed accuracy. There's a great quote from Alec Baldwin on the documentary where he says that Tom Clancy could describe a government issue pencil in 3 pages. And the book
is the
pretty...
Dostoevsky of bureaucracy.
Indeed. So essentially, super, super detail-oriented, because I think this movie lays the foundation, obviously, for all the rest of the the Jack Ryan series, which we'll talk about.
Monster,
but also,
Monster in the 90s. Those
absolutely,
movies and those books.
huge cultural impact. But I think there's an argument to say that this lays the foundation for a lot of Tony Scott's work in this space. Enemy of the State, of course, Crimson Tide, Spy Game, and the Bourne movies to some extent, which I think are hyper realist, kind of technical detail, very, very accurate. We're moving away from the fantasy of James Bond and more into a realistic look at the world of espionage
and the post Cold War kind of like thaw, like the glasnost of like this is like enacted like a terrible cost on people, and like we can't kind of goof off with these. I would say this movie's perched somewhere in the middle, as you pointed out, but there's some seriousness to it, I think. Yeah,
and it's also interesting you mentioned the Cold War thing, because it's what Connery almost didn't do the movie because he was faxed the script like at late notice, and he didn't get the cover page that said this took place before the Cold War, because he was confused. He was like, well, we're at like glasnost now. We're perestroika. We're, the Cold War is over. Why are we telling a story that's sort of inflaming Russian and American tensions? And
thank God that's not a problem anymore.
Moving on. So anyway, yes, that the Cold War context is very important to this, because it's looking back. The movie's made in 1990, but I believe set in 1984.
Well, to your point about techno thrillers, and I don't have the text in front of me, but this film opens with a digital map of like, in that classic almost video game style where like the continents are defined by a green line and the ocean and the continents look the same. And there's this deal that's like in 1984, a Typhoon class Soviet submarine, what is it? Like sort of what's the word I'm looking for here? Like it came up near the Grand Banks. It was called the training exercise, but according to both American and Soviet officials, none of what you're about to see ever really happened. And like, there's no greater way to start a movie.
Yeah, it's a great
It's
hook.
like Fargo. It's a little bit of that, like, this is based on a true story thing.
False mythologizing of history.
Which is so exciting. And like every time that happens, I get like goosebump city if a movie starts with like, this never really, it's such an exciting
but
thing
yet
to happen.
It's so, because the film is so, at least creates the perhaps the illusion of being incredibly realistic, and I think it is pretty darn realistic. You do buy that this could have happened.
100%. It's really rooted in real life. Yeah. And the other name that comes onto this paper that I think is really interesting, certainly not all of his movies, but Michael Mann, whose masterpiece Heat is like incredibly technical and precise, and train those guys how to really shoot rifles and what a gun battle would look like if it played out on the streets of LA in 1995.
Absolutely. And I think sort of Michael Mann was on his own kind of techno thriller track with with Thief and then Manhunter, but then certainly Heat and Miami Vice. Yeah. And his last film, Black Hat.
I love Black Hat.
It's an interesting companion piece to this sort of espionage techno thriller world. I think this movie showed that audiences actually had a thirst for intelligent, detail-oriented stories that just drop you in a world that you don't necessarily understand, and they trust you to keep up, rather than spoon-feeding you every step of the way. I think it's an important film that this was a big hit in terms of box office, because it proved that audiences were hungry for movies that actually were, intelligent.
Absolutely. And just, I want to come back to when we get into our anatomy of an action movie section, I want to get into like how complicated and yet how simple like the plot of this movie actually is, which it really is both at the same time. I love submarine movies. I think they're great.
So tell me about that. Like, where does that come from?
It's funny. I think so this movie specifically was a movie that I did not see in the theater. I was probably a little too young to see. I was probably 8 when it came out, but I remember renting it. I remember it being on TV, and I remember it being like among the first 5 DVDs I bought. So, which included things like Snake Eyes, The Rock.
Nice.
Snake Eyes rules.
Yeah.
Like a lot of big action movies. And I remember I only had a few DVDs. Out of Sight was an early DVD I bought. So I would rewatch things a lot. And I think that The Matrix, I sort of started to
think...
Late
90s.
I sort of started to think about Fight Club. Sorry, I'm just going to keep thinking of movies.
What else did you have in the collection? I need to know.
The Insider.
Yeah.
But like because I didn't have a ton of Blu-rays or DVDs, I would rewatch these. After school, I would throw one on. So like I've probably seen, for example, the first hour of The Hunt for Red October 50 times. Yeah. I've probably seen the second hour 20 times or whatever, right? So they're ingrained into me. And I also think that like it's hard to talk about The Hunt for Red October without talking about, if we're talking about submarine movies, Crimson Tide.
Yeah.
Which I just think is like a totally perfect action masterpiece.
Well, Crimson Tide does not exist without this. Without this proving that you can make an expensive film with a big star, and in case of Crimson Tide, 2 big stars, that the mainstream audiences will embrace.
Exactly. And the other thing that's interesting about submarine movies is that essentially a submarine movie, and I think I wonder your thoughts on this, are essentially plays.
Well, absolutely, and it's funny. I was thinking about how with this incredible cast, you could mount a Shakespearean production. Yeah, I mean, it's the cast is so crazy, and they all feel like they come from a sort of classy theatrical tradition.
It's real actors doing real work.
Yes,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, international cast. Yeah. It is like a play. What I think is fascinating about submarine movies and just the submarine as a context, which leads us into our Anatomy of an Action movie. The premise: submarine, one of the most terrifying places imaginable. Yeah. In one of the most terrifying places imaginable, which is in underwater in the ocean, being hunted. So you're in a inherently claustrophobic setting, which is its own challenge. Then you've got if you can't go outside because you'd be in deep pressure water, which is its own nightmare. And you've got in this instance, and in most submarine stories, other submarines hunting you. You can die in about 8 million ways. You can't see them. You can't even make a sound on these things. They're like from the research that I was studying about it, when the actors went on the real submarines, they said basically it's like a library, Everyone's just soft voice, quiet. It must be, I don't know how anybody does it.
I can't imagine. And I think what that also does for an action movie is it inherently creates a pressure cooker.
Exactly.
But more than that, you can't rely on shootouts. You can't rely on chases. You can't rely on some of the tropes. So this movie relies on mystery, on subterfuge, on imagining things outside of what we can visually see. And I think that that's exceptionally cinematic. We'll get into this when we talk about I want to save this for when we get into an action movie, but I think that the reason it feels actor first, and that's a rare thing. It feels actor and dialogue
It's a drama.
It's a
drama.
Yeah.
At the center of all this is a human drama,
right?
With a fantastical war context with huge stakes and huge scale, but there's also a human intimacy going on between the characters and in close proximity.
And I think that makes me reflect a little bit on Tom Clancy. Tom Clancy, it's like hard to overstate. We're gonna sound like old guys, but it's hard to overstate. Like for me, like Tom Clancy, I wasn't a big Tom Clancy reader, but like. There's three movies that really define some of my taste in like the early to mid 90s, and it is The Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games, and Clear and Present Danger.
Yeah.
All action movies, but all movies with a character, a lead that you like, a smart lead, a thoughtful CIA analyst, played by an actor in both cases who knew how to turn it down and focus on their intelligence and their like analytical brain rather than being action heroes. So the action almost seems like this is for the hero section, I think.
Sure,
but
yeah.
I just think that like they defined a kind of thoughtful action movie that I really, really love and candidly wish like there was more of now.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very significant in that regard, and I think it's important that this film was a box office hit, and that it showed that this kind of material could engage the mainstream.
Yeah, you don't feel talked down to or overly explained to, or any of the like traditional, it feels like a smart. Watching this movie feels like you're
you feel
using
like
your
you've got
brain
a little smarter having watched it.
For
actually.
Sure,
like
feels like a great way to segue into our Anatomy of an Action movie.
Sure.
So Phil,
yes,
your Anatomy of an Action movie has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 categories.
Yes.
I'm going to list them for
Okay.
folks that haven't.
Yeah.
And then I want you to start the academic lecture that is the anatomy of an action movie in a very good way. I'm now bored.
No.
We have our premise, story, plot, all those things. We're going to group them all together. Our hero. Let's talk a little bit about the hero. Our villain or villains, and the villain can be the sea or war itself. The ticking clock, the thing that makes the movie move. And this movie has some great ticking clocks.
Oh, yeah. It has an abundance.
The action, I feel like that explains itself. Though action is a fun thing to debate, and the humor of the movie. So those are the 6 categories we're going to talk about in our section, Anatomy of an Action Movie. Professor Gawthorne, please kick us off with the premise.
Well, yeah. So the premise of this movie, as you said, this is both it's deceptively, it's both simple and complex. The simple version is Soviet submarine captain Marco Ramius takes this new nuclear submarine, Red October, out on its maiden voyage, and his behavior suggests he may have gone rogue. But the CIA analyst Jack Ryan believes that this enigmatic figure of Ramius actually intends to defect. And as the world teeters on the brink of war, he must convince the US military that Ramius' intentions are not hostile and help get his sub to safety. That actually isn't that simple, is it? It sounded simple. But basically what we have is a sort of A to B movie. Get this sub through the gauntlet of the Russian and US naval forces to a safe haven. That's the simple version of it. But within that, the individual mechanics are incredibly complex. So it has a kind of very clear thrust with very clear stakes.
Yes.
But yet the individual components are filled with nuance and minutia, and it's constantly moving, and our loyalties are shifting. But yeah, it's interesting because it's clear, it's straightforward, but yet it immerses you with its attention to detail.
Yeah, and I think that's a great description. And there's a lot of other things going on. This submarine has what's called a caterpillar drive, which means it can run silent and run deep, to reference another submarine movie. And there's a great sequence where Ryan is talking to a sort of submarine head, and he talks about how during the Cuban Missile Crisis, someone parked a submarine off the coast of Florida, and they built a bomb shelter. And now, in this film, it's like someone could plant a warhead off the coast of Washington and New York, and no one would know anything about it till it's over. Like,
yeah, he literally says a couple of hundred warheads,
right?
Because of the stealth capability of the Red October.
And this is where this movie is a drama, because you have this line, the world teeters on the brink of war. But what's great about this movie is you never see like a nuclear holocaust. You never have a moment where like they spend a ton of money to make an effect that doesn't quite like land. It's all in glances. It's all in conversation. It's all in the way that people talk to each other. And this is kind of what I think we mean when we talk about like, this is kind of a chamber drama.
Yeah.
It's also an action movie.
Yeah.
It's all rooted in watching actors act, because it's really expensive and hard to do cool submarine stuff. What you can do really well is have Tim Curry's anxious face, or Alec Baldwin shaking on a C-130. Like, it's all really rooted in understanding the stakes through performance and through as an action. And that's why I think I love this movie, is that you could almost cut out some of the more action-y elements of it, particularly out the submarine stuff, and it would be as impressive an achievement. Another thing that I love about this movie, to come back to that, is that it's about as much about small moments as big moments. One of my favorite storylines in this movie is Courtney Vance as Jonesy, the seaman, hearing something in the audio, and we throughout the first, like, say 30 minutes of the movie, we keep cutting back to him listening. We keep cutting back to him trying to figure something out, and then he gets to present an argument to Scott Glenn. Look, I'm hearing this sound. This is where I last heard it. If I draw on the map, I can tell you that this thing is heading for Thor's twins, and they're going to go through and they're going to end up at the Grand Banks or whatever it is. And Scott Glenn says, let's plot a course to go to the Grand Banks. And you see Jonesy go, like, he decompresses, because he's kind of the hero of the movie. If he doesn't make that determination, they are not there when the Red October surfaces. And so you feel caught up in the dramas of characters that aren't Marco Ramius, that aren't Jack Ryan, and you feel it's an ensemble movie on some level as well.
Courtney B. Vance was actually, at the time, was a theatrical actor who was not interested in doing movies, but McTiernan persuaded him to do this, and McTiernan talks about that on the commentary. So that those theatrical roots are there. You can tell that all these guys are incredibly muscular, strong.
I've seen Courtney Vance do Shakespeare. He's incredible. He's so good in all of these
this cast could easily mount a Shakespearean production, a Chekhov production.
Great.
You name it.
The cast of Hunt for October presents Coriolanus or Julius Caesar. I would watch the hell out of that. Are you kidding?
Absolutely.
I think it's just such an exciting movie and really driven. And actually, and this is where we could get into it a little bit. I think when it tries to do some more traditional action things in the second half of the film, it loses a little bit of momentum for me. And I still think it's great, but once they board the Red October, I'm a little bit more like, oh yeah, we got a mole, or we have a saboteur on the boat. They shoot at each other. Like, I remember that being a bigger deal than it actually ends up being in the movie. And I think that the movie for me, and I think it's a masterpiece, but it works the best in the moments of absorbing tension rather than releasing tension. Like. And I think this is maybe an opportunity to segue into our hero jumping right into Jack Ryan. But there is a moment in this movie that really stuck out to me in the context of what we're doing on this podcast, because there is actually a John McClane moment in this movie. There's two things that I think are really John McClane-y.
Back to school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop tax-free August 2nd through 6th and save up to 70% off the latest school styles. The best of apparel, footwear, accessories, and more. Save at Nike Factory Store, American Eagle, Gap Outlet, Crocs, Under Armour, Banana Republic Factory, and hundreds more. There's always something happening. Discover the latest fun and events all season long. Tanger Outlets, your savings destination.
Can I present them?
Please.
One is a fly in the ointment, a pain in the ass in this movie is just, I'm an analyst. Like, I'm a guy who's like, I'm not supposed to be here. Like, I'm not the guy that boards the
he didn't choose
the Red
this
October
situation. He falls into it by circumstance.
And I love how the first thing we see in the movie is all of his like nerdy warship stuff in his house, and he's like wearing this cardigan sweater and like.
He's an academic.
He's an academic.
He's a thinking man.
And I love that a thinking man has to take action. I think that's a really exciting thing. But the second thing is later on in the film, he's chasing down the saboteur, the guy who is trying to, for the KGB agent who's trying to stop the Red October from defecting. There's a whole side of this movie that we didn't get into, the espionage stuff. But Baldwin is crawling on a platform
and sort of steel grate.
And he essentially does, I don't remember what he says, but he essentially does the equivalent of come out to the coast, we'll have a few laughs.
100%.
And it struck me as so John McClane. And I'm curious, like, what your thoughts, does that moment work for you?
I actually found that part of it. So, we talked about the Shakespearean nature of this and, McTiernan's, the Shakespearean influence on it. But what we have with Jack Ryan is a hero that soliloquies. Does soliloquies. And he does, it's cleverly done. I find it very believable when he does it earlier on. He's in the shower on the Fred Dalton Thompson's aircraft carrier.
Fred Dalton Thompson.
Shout out to FDT.
One of the great McTiernan.
What a 1990 he had, by the way. Days of Thunder, Die Hard 2, and Hunt for Red October. And then became a U.S. senator.
That's right. It was after. He has big senator vibes.
Yeah.
Big senator vibes.
Big senator energy. Yeah. So, okay, so he like I think it's very believable when he is processing his thoughts and he's saying, okay, so how do you get a crew off the nuclear submarine?
I love it. I love that.
I find that very believable. I do that sometimes
in
when
the shower,
trying to get out of just trying to when you're trying to get out of your own head, like you're trying to sort of get out of your own head and kind of quantify it. And I believe that as like a problem-solving strategy. I think when it gets to the point where he is crawling along the steel grate and he's doing a Sean Connery impression, and he's literally says like, most things around here don't react well to bullets. That type of thing. My Connery's pretty weak sauce, but we can all take a swing at it.
Do it when he's speaking Russian.
Just put a little top spin on that impression. Yeah. So I find that bit a little bit like almost outside the tone of the movie. That is because the stakes are so high in this situation. He's literally you have a saboteur who is trying to blow up this ship with them all on it. We've got, the specter of nuclear war in the background. Is that the time to be making sort of self-referential? Yeah. That was the one moment where it was like I had a slight, that tone feels very much like you're almost cribbing from what was successful about Die Hard was the humor.
Yes.
Of course, humor can be, and we'll talk about that in the humor section, but can be a great way to diffuse tension, remind the audience, hey, this is still fun. We're still enjoying the movie.
Well, let's talk about the humor then. Why not just talk about it now? Do you think that there's some funny moments in this movie, but they all seem to need... So first of all, let me jump back. I agree with you 100%. That moment really pulled me out of the movie. And I have some thoughts about and we can talk about it in the hero segment. We're jumping around a little bit here. But I don't really think this is a particularly funny movie, and I don't necessarily need it to try to be funny. I actually appreciate that the humor comes out of like Baldwin being like, son of a bitch, and all the senators being like, do you have something to add, Mr. Ryan?
I was dying to do that impression. You beat me to it.
No, you have to do it.
It's like Hannibal Lecter-esque.
You want me to cue you?
Yes, please.
Son of a bitch!
You have something to add, Dr. Ryan?
You are uncanny.
Apparently that's an Indiana accent that he does. I don't know if anyone can speak to the authenticity of that accent, but I love him in it. It is very Hannibal Lecter level,
that's true.
Chomping the scenery with the accent, but that character needs to be vivid.
He's very
because
strong.
You're in a room of like suits, and this character needs to be a little bit the volume turned up on him to stand out.
Right.
So for me, that does work.
Well, and there's funny moments. Like one of the funny moments in the movie is the early Paganini, Pagliacci stuff.
Right.
It's funny because it's like rooted in like these are one of the things I wrote down about this movie just as a note was competent people doing their jobs,
which is very Michael Mann, by the way.
Yes.
And something just I wanted to bring that up, just not to cut you off, but it's something that I think Michael Mann proved and has doubled down on, which is that audiences like watching really smart people be really good at their jobs.
Yep.
Manhunter has that in spades. Heat has that in spades. Most of his work does.
Yeah, no, I think it's almost everything. The Insider, he really believes that like audiences are smart and people are competent.
Yeah.
And he wants to and this movie does that too.
It's fun to watch people be really, really good at their jobs and then throw them in conflict.
Right. No, 100%. And it's like and that's humor that's rooted in actual people. I mean, Tim Curry is really funny in this movie. You'll get the Order of Lenin for this, Captain. And it's like the humor in that situation, again, it's dramatic irony. It's McTiernan, the dramatist, being like, Tim Curry is kind of a dunce. He doesn't understand what's going on. Yeah. He's really funny in the scene. Again, there's a scene where, interestingly enough, the KGB guy, Putin, is murdered by Sean Connery. And Connery's like, I'm going to take both missile keys. And Tim Curry's like, you can't do that. Yeah. And it's funny. He's so good because the humor is in the power dynamic and the fact that Connery is just kind of fucking with him. Yeah. I think the best humor in this movie comes from character.
I agree. I think, Connery has this dry wit that is just intrinsic to him. So the way, for example, when he's like, I give us one chance in 3 while he's just eating his dinner, things like that.
Totally.
Just
You're
kind of
afraid of our fleet.
Yeah, it doesn't need to do what that moment with Baldwin is doing when he's coming on the steel grate, which is almost winking at the audience and reminding them like, hey, we're in a movie, it's okay to have fun.
Yeah.
It was the one moment where I just felt a bit of a tonal skid. But I had Tim Curry being just a low-key delight in the humor and Rick Ducommun's hilarious cameo. But for the most part, it's not a funny movie and it doesn't need to be. I don't always need to be made to laugh. And actually, I find the trend today with spectacle action blockbuster stuff is so winking at the audience
and glibbish.
Just the sense of detached irony. To me, it's I want to be swept up in the movie. I don't want you to be constantly reminding me it's a movie. I know it's a fucking movie. I'm here eating my popcorn.
I paid my $18.
I'm not confused about that I'm in this reality, but I want that's part of what goes on psychologically is to be swept up in it. Don't constantly take me out of it. To me, it's breaking that. So I don't get me wrong, like, a lot of movies that we've talked about, Die Hard especially, Lethal Weapon, they have a great sense of humor, but they feel appropriately placed within the tone and context of
it's rooted
story.
In the reality of the story. let's talk about our heroes.
Yes.
But I feel like in a podcast
heroes
about,
plural.
Exactly. And I feel like in a podcast about Hunt for Red October, we haven't talked about arguably the greatest thing about the movie. Sean Connery.
Mr. Sean Connery.
Oh my! Is this a top 10 movie star performance of all time?
I'll say this: if from the opening shot of the movie, or the opening sequence of the movie begins with a close-up of Sean Connery's eyes scanning this frozen Russian landscape in the water as the Red October is about to depart. And to me, what it made me think of was like, this is like a Rorschach painting, where the first time you watch it, you're not necessarily sure what he's thinking, but it's so layered with subtext that he could be thinking about, like, I'm leaving my motherland.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
My wife has died. I'm about to go on a very, very perilous journey. He's already effectively burned his ship because we know he sent the letter to Moscow in saying his. We don't know that yet, but these are things that enrich the performance when you look back at it. Do you see there's so much complexity in his eyes in that shot, and McTiernan trusts that, and Connery is just has this, just star wattage and extraudinary acting talent that we sometimes forget, because he is a truly amazing actor as well as being an amazing movie star. And you believe that the crew would follow him. You believe that the officers would follow. It takes an actor, I think, to have of someone who has that much gravitas to make a story like this believable. It has to be like, this is a guy that you would go, this guy is going to go through hell, an underwater hell, and it needs to be believable that people would follow him. Yeah. And Sean Connery has that in spades.
And McTiernan's so smart. So originally it was a different actor. He came in, it's incredible. He came in like 4 days before, requested 1 day of rehearsal. But the movie does two things. It relies on his extraordinary acting ability. It relies on his star wattage. And it also relies on our relationship to Sean Connery as a veteran of movies, because we instantly believe him as a guy who has spent 40 years like fighting the fight and maybe was a true believer and is now so disillusioned by, it's interesting, the film never really gets into his politics, but what it does get into through his eyes, through his looks, through his like weary resignation of like the country that it's interesting that he's not Russian.
Right.
He's the Vilnius schoolmaster.
Lithuanian, yeah.
But the fact that we never hear him be like, I hate the Soviet Union, or I don't believe in communism anymore. It's all rooted in the performance.
There is an interesting section in the book which talks explicitly about his motivations and about how the death of his wife was a sort of chain of causality that was all a series of failures of the Soviet state, like in terms of the medical profession, in terms of just a kind of confluence of circumstances that all she was like a victim of the culture and a victim of politics, and the just various kind of institutional failures.
Wow.
So the movie touches on that. The book has a whole section of it that you totally understand how his motivations are. It's brilliant because it's both emotional and personal. It's also ideological.
Right.
So that was the movie does touch on that. He obviously the death of his wife is significant, and that's something that Jack Ryan cracks into, because Jack Ryan's sort of an amateur psychological sleuth, isn't he? With the way that he works out his motivations, the anniversary of his wife's death.
That scene, Baldwin's incredible in the scene where he reasons through. We'll get to Baldwin, but incredible scene.
But I think it is what's interesting about this film is the fact that we have two heroes, but the second hero, the Ramius character of Sean Connery that we're talking about now, we don't know. The first time you're watching it, you're not sure if he's the hero, because one of the first things he does, as you mentioned, is murdered a fellow officer, the KGB officer. And so for the first act, where if you're going in completely cold, you don't know anything about this movie, you're not sure if Ramius is a good guy or a bad guy. We think he could be the antagonist. I think probably the casting of Sean Connery versus the other actor somewhat negate. You probably know that, okay, he's probably not going to be a villain.
Yeah, he's not going to be like but he's a murderer.
But he does do something He personally murders somebody.
It's one of the only deaths in the film. I mean, actually, there's how many people died? 2 people.
It's pretty
died
nasty.
In this movie? Not that many.
There's
more than that.
There's the guy. There's the cook. Skarsgård's sub. Gets explodes, but there's also, in terms of like people that we see personified on screen, I think it's really only him at the beginning, and then the other KGB agent at the end,
and Sam Neill.
Oh, of course, and Sam Neill.
Incredible in this movie.
So much to say about him.
It would have been better if you had not informed Moscow. Very quickly.
Yes.
I think Connery is the hero of this movie. In some ways, I think, we'll get there. I'm jumping ahead, and I don't mean to.
Go for it.
The last thing I want to say about Baldwin, before we move on, who I think part of that humor thing that we talked about, where he kind of does the soliloquy, and like we have that moment in the film where he's sort of doing the come out to the coast, have a few laughs. That is Baldwin 20 years later. And this is a really interesting Baldwin performance because, as you said when we were talking about this movie, he changed his career after this. He didn't want to be the like charming, charismatic, or just not even charismatic, though he is charismatic. He didn't want to be the leading man. He didn't want to be an action hero. He wanted to be a character actor, and he wanted to be funny. I mean, he's a comedian now, right? On some level. But he leans into his later career persona here. It's like the first sort of viewing of it. And it's interesting how it does not jive with the rest of the performance in the movie.
Yeah.
You know, because he's the hero, but in that moment you're kind of like, what are you doing? And by the way, it's hard not to talk about the last scene of this movie where they're sailing into Maine and they have a brief conversation about how Baldwin grew up in Maine. And it's a great ending.
I love that.
It's
I
so
love
quiet.
the dialogue exchange.
Yeah.
And the last line of the movie, "Welcome to the New World," is just such a that is a profound concept that has echoes
in
through time.
1990, and for sure.
It's a complex idea. It's also it's an emotional idea.
Yeah.
And to me, that was just what a beautiful note to end this symphony on again.
A human moment. It's a human moment.
But it's also thematic.
Right. Yeah. It is a thematic
historical,
moment.
Yeah,
and complicated from a historical perspective, for sure. Oh man, this movie rules.
I love this movie.
Just can't
it's
get
so
enough.
good.
It is so good. A couple other quick heroes: Scott Glenn doing yeoman's work as Bart Mancuso. Great name, by the way, Bart Mancuso. James Earl Jones as Admiral Greer. I would be remiss if we did not mention him. Let's talk about, and of course, Courtney B. Vance as Seaman Jonesy, my hero of the movie. I just appreciate that the hero of the movie is a sound intellectual. I felt seen by the...
Oh, I see. Now it's making sense. Okay.
The hero of the movie is a sound intellectual.
Right.
Let's talk about some villains.
Yes.
There are great actors in this movie who have played villains. Mm-hmm. But this is not a movie of villains, I feel like.
Not really. It's an unusual one in the sense there that it sort of breaks the paradigm because we have two heroes and we don't have one specific villain. There is no Hans Gruber type character. There is no Tommy Lee Jones in Under Siege. There is no like vivid, charismatic bad guy. What we have is is a more abstract villain, which is the specter of war and nuclear war. There are some specific villains, like the Joss Ackland character, who's the Soviet ambassador, and Stellan Skarsgård, who is the sort of arrogant sub-captain who's after Ramius. But it's more abstract. But yet there are sort of forces of antagonism, like the National Security Advisor, Jeffrey Pell, and then Bart Mancuso, the Scott Glenn character, who become allies. So it's actually a very unusual storytelling paradigm from an action movie standpoint.
That's really interesting because what I was going to say in response to that, and you just added to it, is there are almost like mini villains throughout the movie. Yeah. There is the senator who Jack Ryan lays into, and he's like, I actually met Ramius at a dinner in Moscow. Have you ever met him? The Joint Chief? And that guy kind of shuts up and disappears. And then there's Daniel Davis playing Captain Davenport, who's like, what are you, crazy? Like, none of this stuff is happening. In the scene where he's with Fred Dalton Thomas, and then Fred Dalton Thomas is like, maybe this guy's a war hero. Like maybe give him a break. And I like that the movie, again, I'm more curious about your perspective, but it feels a little bit like every scene is accounted for in terms of what's the conflict in this scene. Mm-hmm. And so instead of like thinking of it as like a world destroying villain, it's like the enemies, the villains in this movie are the people that do not believe Jack Ryan.
Yes.
It's much more
interesting because I was sort of playing out in my head today as well that like if you play out the beat by beat, causality of this story, without Jack Ryan, Ramius would die. He wouldn't make it. Because
we get some buckaroo, right?
Mancuso, the Scott Glenn character, would kill him if Stellan Skarsgård didn't, right? it hinged on his plan, and he even said himself, "I'll give us a 1 in 3 chance." Ramius says that to his officers. He's sort of comfortable with the risk factor,
right?
But without Ryan's interceding to convince the U.S. military that he intends to defect, because how else would Ramius have conveyed to the U.S. that he intended to defect? He's told the Russians, and they're going to hunt him down regardless. So without Jack Ryan's X factor in this, in this scenario, I don't think Ramius would.
Well, there's that extraordinary scene where they're communicating via
Periscope.
Periscope. They're
pings.
doing the pings.
Morse code,
And there's Connery again because this great moment where he realizes that he's not talking to a buckaroo, and he pauses and looks down and again.
It's like, this could work.
Great movie acting because it's all in the brain. He's thinking it through, and we're watching him. He's having the thoughts, and we're watching him have the thoughts. And it's the movie has, McTiernan has the respect to hold the shot and know that, we're watching a guy figure something out. And that, by the way, is an action movie. That's an action movie.
This is what I think is one of an intangible factor of a true blue movie star. Brings us into their heart and soul without words, just by their expression.
Right.
And Connery has that, and especially in that scene. So very unusual. Hero, villain, very different.
It almost feels as though it reflects the post-Cold War reality. There's just no way that there are no heroes and villains anymore.
It's all morally shades of grey in this world, isn't it?
It's more the world is more complicated now. It's become more complicated, and I think that's one of the things that makes Clancy successful as a writer. Is he sort of went okay, what is. How can I take actual world conflict and future troubles and turn it into thoughtful, exciting action?
Compare this to another Paramount military movie that came out 4 years earlier that we absolutely love, Top Gun. In terms of the sophistication of geopolitical,
pretty good movie,
amazing movie, right? But it's looking to your point about through the political prism, how simplistic it is versus how complex this is. I think is significant. Also we're moving to the end of the Cold War era by this point, and so forth. But I think it was. My point is, I think it's unusual to show such a nuanced political landscape at that time, which tended to be pretty much we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. This is how Hollywood works, and there's a propagandistic element to it. This movie is a bit more sophisticated in its portrayals, although some would argue it still reinforces certain
classic antagonism.
Directed towards the Soviet Union and so forth.
It's hard not to because of the cultural complexity of that. But I will say the films that follow this one, Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger, we've talked about this, offer a similarly nuanced situation on world conflicts. I mean, Patriot Games does I think is one of the better.
I love Patriot Games. I'm obsessed with it.
One of the better movies about Northern Ireland.
Yes, I agree.
Especially in an action context. It's sympathetic to both sides, I think, of the conflict in some ways, and realizes it's complicated. And Clear and Present Danger has a complicated relationship to the drug
war on drugs.
And they're both again.
And the president of the U.S. is a villainous figure in Clear and Present Danger.
Right.
So it paved the way for a more nuanced and sophisticated look at the moral complexities of international politics in mainstream movies.
Can we do a Clancy cast?
Yes.
Just on these things. I'd like to announce that we're doing 10 new podcasts. So talking villains.
Yes.
I think we need to cover the one sort of traditional villain in this movie.
Yes.
And that is Captain Tupolev.
Stellan Skarsgård.
The great Stellan Skarsgård.
In an early role, pretty young.
Incredible.
I had an interesting thought about that character that occurred to me, and it was really off the back of something that you had picked up on Die Hard, which I hadn't really tuned into, which was the class element, because it is mentioned that the Skarsgård's character descends from aristocracy.
Oh, right.
Whereas Ramius, I think was raised by his paternal grandfather, who was a fisherman.
In Lithuania.
So again, we have this sympathy towards a more blue-collar hero, and there is a critique of, the aristocracy, which is sort of in Die Hard to some extent with its corporate executives and the suspicion of authority and the suspicion of sort of inherited wealth and what have you. It's just a subtle thing, but I thought it was significant that I think especially within the Russian system also have, or the Soviet system, that there is still an aristocracy, even though it's supposed to be a sort of unifying, everyone is equal, but there's some are more equal than others type thing. So I think it was interesting that they made that point that he was descended from aristocracy and was also Ramius's student. So he's quite, even though he's not in it much, it's quite a dimensional character.
He's also crazy.
Yeah.
Like he's
hubris personified.
He understands the assignment. Like, you have to be the guy that we know will blow this boat out of the water. I think it's really interesting that there's the teacher-student dynamic, because the goal of the teacher is always the goal of the student is always to overtake the teacher, right? And I like how they set them up as like, oh, he taught him everything he knows. And now for Stellan Skarsgård, it's like, I have to capture this guy. I have to kill this guy. But he doesn't seem excited about it. He doesn't want to do it. Like, I like that there's this resign, like, fuck. Like, we've got to go.
Oh, that's interesting that you read it that way.
I don't read him as a cowboy. I read him as insane and, like, I have to do what I have to do. But when he first reads the orders, he's like, okay, here we go. It feels a little more complicated in terms of that dynamic.
Think there's a bit, I almost feel like maybe it's a little bit like he's overcompensating. You know, it's sort of like he believes his arrogance makes him think he can do this, but actually it's also maybe sort of balanced out with like some insecurity because he's actually not that good as the ending kind of proves.
That's interesting. Yeah, so, he fucks up.
I mean, Skarsgård does a lot with a little, you know? I mean, he's incredible.
One of the great cigarette actors.
Yeah.
It's not an easy thing to do. And like, that guy smokes 400 cigarettes a day.
On a submarine, no less.
Can you imagine? I would be really annoyed. Yeah. Great villains, but I think you're right. The villain of this movie is ultimately war itself. Yeah. And I think, you know, to your point about aristocracy and the fishermen, I think one thing that's faded probably from our lives in watching this movie is our understanding of the geopolitical situation in the late 80s, early 90s in the world, and how like some of this feels a little more abstract than it would if we were seeing the movie when it came out.
Yeah, you can almost. I mean, it's weird because things have come full circle, but probably in the intervening decades, you could enjoy this vicariously. Now it's pretty close to home, and at the time, I think it would have been pretty close to home. But although things were kind of winding down in terms of the Cold War in 1990, but it's an interesting historical document for sure in terms of its geopolitical portrayals.
It's great. The ticking clock.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, some of the movies we've been doing haven't. License to Kill didn't really have a ticking clock. Roadhouse's ticking clock was somewhat, was pretty weak towards the end. This has at least 3 that I could identify. Well, one is, will Ramius make it to the safety of the US before either Soviet or US military take him out? Another is, can Ryan convince the military that Ramius is really defecting before they attack? They're somewhat connected. And then will this situation escalate into a full-on war or even a nuclear confrontation between US and Soviet forces? But there is an inherent ticking clock in the sense, like I said, that the Red October needs to get from point A in the Soviet Union to point B, the US waters, intact. That is, so like we talked about with Speed or some of these other movies where it's almost intrinsic to the concept. It's pretty cut and dry, but yet within that there's these other sort of other mechanisms going on.
Well, I guess it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this as a screenwriter, because I think the movie plays very effectively with what you know when you know it. And, you know, if we don't know, for example, we don't know Ramius's motivations at the beginning of the film. We don't even, we hear Jack Ryan's speculations about his intent to defect before Connery explicitly says he's going to defect. Mm-hmm. And there's a great scene. This movie's really good on spilling tea, like literally people spilling their tea. Yeah. But there's a great scene where the Russian the head of state? I forget who the character is, gets a letter from Marco Ramius and is about to sip his tea and puts it down and then drops his tea because he's reading a letter that says Ramius is going to defect. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't know if that letter says, I'm going to nuke the U.S. or I'm going to defect.
It's a classic narrative enigma, and this film is filled with them of like delayed gratification technique, essentially, you know, where that's a classic one. A character reads a letter look shocked, and then you cut away. And those are the kind of things that keep you watching. This is also something that McTiernan, and this is even in his first movie, Nomads, which is available on YouTube, and it's kind of a bizarre, interesting movie, but his sure-footed handling of suspense is what led to him getting Predator. It's actually, Schwarzenegger actually talks about it in his autobiography. He says that he was so good at suspense on such a low budget that convinced us that he would be the right guy for Predator. But you wouldn't necessarily look at Nomads and then go, oh yeah, he could handle this big Schwarzenegger sci-fi action movie. But he is so good at suspense.
Right. And again, I think so much of his skill comes from the fact that he's like a classic dramatist. He knows when to tell you things. He knows when to keep things from you. He knows how to get good performances out of actors. And he knows how to like, one of my favorite scenes in this movie is just the scene of all of the of Ramius and his crew having lunch together, and the interpersonal dynamics, and how clearly defined every character in that scene is.
That's a staple of sort of chamber piece drama, right? The family, the sort of family type, sitting around the dinner table, and there's all these complicated conflicts. What I thought was interesting about that you mentioned on the commentary was that he keeps the camera in one place so that you feel as an audience that you're at that dinner table.
You're next to Ramius, and then you watch all of the crew in a single wide. That's
it doesn't cut around in terms of where the camera is positioned, so it gives it you feel like you're there.
It also does this thing that's very smart, where the shot of Ramius is a two. So you're with Sam Neill, and you're with Marco Ramius, and then you're with the rest of the crew. And so and he places Sam Neill in the middle of that because he's somewhere between the crew.
Right. He's the conduit, yeah.
He's the conduit.
Poor Tim Curry got kicked out of that meeting.
We need those nuclear tests.
Sent on a bullshit errand. He was just about to chow down.
I also just love how he's such like a bourgeois, slimy, like,
he was
went
at
to
the ballet. Yeah.
You know how beautiful she was.
Again, the class.
Yep. They don't trust him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, that's right. That's probably partly why he's not one of them.
Right. And also Putin, the KGB agent, as an antagonist in the film, the one that Ramius dispatches. There's clearly some tension between them that's really interesting, and him as like an apparatus.
He's an ideologue, isn't he?
Right.
He's clearly like he's almost sort of an apparatus of the worst, the tyranny of that political system. He embodies it. Also, that actor Peter Firth is well known to British audiences because he was this key character in the show called Spooks, which was a spy show, BBC spy show that was very popular. So great pedigree.
Before we move into our action.
Yes.
Okay. One thing I want to just comment on, speaking of that sequence, I love the way McTiernan handles language. I think the way that the film begins in Russian. And there's a moment where he has Ramius' what I think is a diary. We're talking about Putin. And he starts reading in Russian. He reads this biblical quote from Revelations, and it pushes in on Putin, and he changes from Russian to English. And now you know, as the audience, they're still speaking Russian, but you hear them in English. Like, he makes a really clear decision as a filmmaker to go like, yeah, you're hearing it's translated. And I just think that like the respect that he gives language, he does something similar in The 13th Warrior, where Banderas learns to speak the language of the village he's in through a sequence. Like, I find that like so thoughtful as a filmmaker, because again, it's not simplistic and glib and going like, oh, the Russians are just the bad guys. What he's doing is going like, no, they're speaking this language, and we're going to like really make you understand that the difference between English and Russian.
What I found interesting about that brilliant technique, a couple of things. One is the word in which it changes, word in which it pivots, is the word Armageddon, which is obviously the theme of the film and is the same in both Russian and English. Also, but he did acknowledge that he was homaging that technique from Judgment at Nuremberg. He actually taken that.
I didn't know that.
There's a scene with Maximilian Schell that does this. That's what inspired him to use that to make that choice.
That's so fascinating. I need to go back and watch Judgment at Nuremberg. Also, one thing that is very smart is that the crew member who first encounters the Americans when they latch onto the ship, when he speaks English, his first few lines are in broken English. Whereas when he spoke in English earlier in the film, it's very clear. So he makes a distinction between Russian that is in English and a Russian speaking English that I think is very, very, again, thoughtful and considerate of the language. Let's talk about the
Agreed.
action.
Let's
Let's
talk about the action on our action movie podcast. So,
this is a chamber drama. I don't think too much about the action.
There's not much.
Yeah.
And yet it's never anything less than thrilling.
Yep.
There are a few action sequences that I particularly love. There's the midair torpedo drop where the Soviet plane drops an airbound torpedo that then splashes into the ocean, and Ramis has to evade it through the underwater canyons. I thought what I thought was really interesting about that is actually that's a scene about mathematics. He's counting in his head.
Yeah.
If you were to say, like, how can you make mathematics like thrilling? That's not an easy thing to do. But Sean Connery and McTiernan pull it off in that scene because he's basically counting. It's all speed, it's velocity, it's turning circles. It's the speed of the torpedo, it's the turning circle of the submarine, it's the amount of the gap that they have. So that was like, again, talk about intelligent action
and grammar.
Brilliant.
They've taught you how to understand this stuff in this movie.
Yes.
And a recent example of this is Top Gun Maverick. It shows you again and again how Maverick can succeed in the mission. So when it finally happens, you feel like educated to understand what's about to happen.
You're never confused, even though what's happening is complex.
Great action filmmaking, I think, sort of teaches you the stakes through some kind of really. It's a great screenwriting thing to think about. How 100%. Do you do it? Yeah.
The other sequence that I absolutely love is Ryan's mid-ocean transfer onto the USS Dallas via helicopter, and when he cuts himself loose and falls into the ocean because he realizes that the helicopter pilots don't trust his, they can successfully get him onto the submarine, so he ends up cutting himself loose essentially and taking a big risk in the hope that a diver is going to save him. What was interesting about that shot was, and again this is why I bring up McTiernan's debut film Nomads, is that shot of somebody falling while looking directly at the camera is in Nomads. Pierce Brosnan throws a guy off a building. It's very Hans Gruber. Of course, the Hans Gruber death is the most iconic one. But then there is a version of this shot that it's very similar, essentially a character falling away in real life. Because Baldwin really did that. And in fact, it was his idea to do that shot, he says on the documentary. He said, wouldn't it be great if we had a shot with the cameras inside the helicopter and you actually see me as the actor fall away? That seems to be one of McTiernan's signature shots.
I wonder if he's afraid of falling. Because I think a lot about this with Christopher Nolan and drowning. Clearly, that's something he's like preoccupied by as a fear, is the fear of drowning. So I always wonder when action filmmakers repeat a sequence, or like when the threat of death is drowning or falling or whatever the case is. Like I'm always really curious.
Out their own obsessions and fears.
It's like how Michael Bay is afraid of dying in an explosion.
Perhaps.
Let's give some awards.
Okay.
The first award is that this movie kicks ass. Let's just give this movie the action-y award for one of the greatest action movies ever made. I'll kick off the awards, and I'm going to expect you as the Academy Board giving member for the Memmy.
Yeah.
The John McClane Yippee-Ki-Yay Award for Best Quip.
Yeah, it was somewhat slim pickings. It's not the most quotable movie. I had 3.
Let's hear them.
Russian. Shall I do it in a horrible Fred Dalton Thompson accent?
Yes.
Russians don't take a dump, son, without a plan.
You think that's terrible? That was so good.
It's pretty terrible.
Okay. Russians don't take a dump without a plan. Okay.
That's Rear Admiral Joshua Painter, played by Fred Dalton Thompson. If that bastard so much as twitches, I'm going to blow him right to Mars. Bart Mancuso, Scott Glenn. But my favorite, and I think this is one of the best lines in any movie of this kind, you never hear somebody say this. I'm a politician, which means I'm a cheat and a liar, and when I'm not kissing babies, I'm stealing their lollipops. But it also means I keep my options open. That's the National Security Advisor, Jeffrey Pelt, played by Richard Jordan. That line was like, that to me speaks to the kind of adult, sophisticated, morally gray worldview that this film has, where it's like, look, he's not claiming like I'm a patriot, I'm defending America here. He's like, I'm a piece of shit, right? I'm an opportunist.
Yep.
This is my job. Let's just be real, base. It's just like, it's so honest. And it makes you like him, even though he's saying something that's really shitty. I'm like, that is genius writing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's the winner. I think
That's
has
my
to be
winner.
that. I think that's a really great. I think my favorite line in the entire film is "I wish I could have seen Montana."
Oh gosh, yeah.
But
well,
that's not a quip. That's certainly not funny. But maybe that leads us into
It does.
the Hans Gruber Master Thief Award for stealing the film. Phil, who are our nominees?
Our nominees are
I'll do the music.
Sam Neill as Captain Second Rank Vasily Borodin, Tim Curry as Dr. Petrov, James Earl Jones as Vice Admiral James Greer, CIA Deputy Director, Courtney B. Vance as Petty Officer Jones, sonar operator, and Richard Jordan as Jeffrey Pelt, the National Security Advisor. Those are my nominees, but please add if you...
What a rogues gallery of nominees.
Who's your pick?
I think you're onto it. I got to be honest, I'm very torn between Courtney B. Vance as Seaman Jones and Sam Neill as Captain Vasily Borodin. I think you have to go with Sam Neill. I think both for me personally, but also his next big thing is this movie gets him Jurassic Park. I think it's just very clear that like this movie made his career something extraordinary. He's extraordinary in this movie.
I
He's
completely
so good.
agree. I agree. Also because he brings the emotional heart, you know, when his simple dreams of living in Montana and driving state to state without papers.
I'm getting a little emotional thinking
But
about
that's it. The film needed a human frailty and vulnerability that was just... He does that so well. Spoiler alert. When he does get shot, you really feel for him. It's really tragic. He is the emotional heart of the film to some extent.
Right.
I also just want to make a correction because in our first episode, I mentioned that Sam Neill was considered for the Hans Gruber part, and I described him incorrectly as Australian. He was born in Omar, Northern Ireland, and worked extensively in Australia, but he grew up in New Zealand and identifies primarily as a New Zealander. So my apologies to Mr. Neill for my mistake and to my Aussie and Kiwi friends for that error.
And listen, Sam, anytime you want to come on the podcast, just let us know.
Open door.
What an extraordinary actor. What an actor who, we were talking earlier about how great movie stars, we identify with them through what they do with their face. There's no better actor than Sam Neill when you think about the moments in this film, but also Jurassic Park when he sees a dinosaur and you're like, this guy is just unbelievable. I'd like to invent one new award, and that award is the Sean Connery Award for playing Marco Ramius in The Hunt for Red October and stealing my, absolutely incredible, megawatt movie star performance. I just think we need to reiterate, he had a late career rebirth with this and Untouchables.
Yeah, and Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones. Yeah. Oh, my God.
Last Crusade.
He's so goddamn good in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. And, some of the other movies around that period, we don't remember as notably, but, what an amazing actor. And, he recently passed away. So I think it's worth pausing and just going, talk about a great, 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 great movie star. One of the greats.
An icon.
The Dick Thornburg Award for Dick of the Movie. Your nominees.
Red October's political officer, Ivan Putin, played by Peter Firth. Joss Ackland's slippery Soviet ambassador, Andrei Lysenko. The arrogant and aggressive Captain Tupolev, played by Stellan Skarsgård. Then we've got the saboteur/cook, Loganov, Thomas Arana, and your favorite, I think, perhaps, or certainly if someone you mentioned, the cowardly dissenting Soviet officer Slavin, played by Boris Lee Krutenog.
Wow, who's your pick for this? It's hard.
Skarsgård.
Yeah.
I gotta just
respect that.
Yeah.
Oh man, I don't know if I can pick one. Maybe Putin. He's just it's just when he goes, you're like, bye.
Yeah.
That guy does an amazing job.
He does an amazing job of making you be okay with the fact that he was just murdered in cold blood.
And that's what this category feels like. Who's the guy who shows up for a minute and just sucks?
Yeah.
Speaking of that, if I can offer a critique of this movie, a small one, but the one woman in the movie, Gates McFadden, is a total jerk for 20 seconds.
Yes,
and
she's super condescending to
the daughter, and I kind of wish they had reshot that moment because it's literally the only time a woman talks in this movie, and she's yells at her kid and is rude to whoever is working for them in that moment, and it doesn't
endear you to her, or
it doesn't play well.
It's no Anne Archer.
Well, that's what I thought about how Anne Archer
in the subsequent movies.
Phil, there's so much more consideration put into her as a character.
She's a great character, especially in Patriot Games. She's got a really prominent part in that.
She's great. And so again, if I have a gripe, it's that like that moment could have been a lot more interesting and a lot more nuanced. The best death.
Yeah. As we mentioned, not a ton of choice. There is the murder of the political officer Ivan Putin, the killing. I think the killing of the saboteur, the cook, or the undercover KGB agent, is significant from an acting standpoint, from Alec Baldwin's acting, because in that moment he realizes what he has to do, and it's no longer theoretical. It's like, I am up close and personal with a gun in my hand, and I am going to have to take this man's life or else we're all going to die. I think Baldwin acts that moment beautifully. And then Stellan Skarsgård's ironic death at his own hands with his own torpedo.
That's a great moment.
You arrogant ass, you've killed us. Yeah.
I think it's worth just mentioning, even though I don't think we give it to him, Sam Neill's death in this movie is pretty significant. But it's
the saddest death.
The saddest death.
This is about fun deaths.
Yeah, this is love a
this
fun
is the language
death.
of action movies.
In that case, well, I would vote for Stellan Skarsgård.
Yeah, I agree. It's just a beautiful button on a fantastic sequence of action where you have conflict both inside and outside the sub.
But good shout on the Alec Baldwin acting moment, because again, I don't think we've laid into how exceptional he is in this movie, and
he's superb.
I think the common cultural idea is like, oh, Harrison Ford took over and the movies got much better, but I think Baldwin could have done 3 sequels to this movie, and I would have absolutely 100%.
It kind of plays to all his strengths to some extent, and he reads as intelligent on screen. He in this era certainly very, he's physical, he's good looking, he's kind of all American.
That voice.
He has a gravitas that's sort of natural, but is also relatable. It was a perfect part for him.
And he's kind of
moment.
a nerd. He's like an eager nerd, and I think it works really, really well.
Yeah, he's great.
All right, it's quiz time.
Yes,
I've got to get quizzed.
All right,
our double Jeopardy.
So I don't know if this is more of a British thing or an American thing, but the Brits, we love a quiz. We love a little quiz. So
Brits, you love a quiz.
We love a quiz. We love a pub quiz. We love a bit of trivia.
How are you on extra credit? Where do you stand on that?
My hope is that people listening to it at home will pause it after the question while they're in the car and kind of try and get the answers.
Call them the answers to us.
All right. So here's number 1. Which legendary action screenwriter and patron saint of this show has a blink and you'll miss it uncredited acting appearance in the film?
First of all, I love what you're doing with your voice here. And that's just a stall so that I can think of the answer to this question. Action screenwriter and patron saint of this podcast. Who is it?
Shane Black.
Oh, get out of here. Shane Black is in this movie?
So this is kind of crazy. So Shane Black, with whom John McTiernan, of course, worked with before on Predator and will work with again on Last Action Hero, appears very briefly as a crewman on the USS Reuben James, which is the American ship that attempts to board the Red October while they're evacuating the crew. So it's like a frigate. And he has one line of dialogue, which is, "He's going down, sir."
Yeah.
McTiernan confirms that in the commentary, and if you pause it, you can see Black pretty clearly, although he's wearing a helmet and he's wearing the large glasses like his Predator character, but it's definitely him, and McTiernan confirms it on the commentary. So kind of a weird piece of trivia.
I'll tell you, I'm more embarrassed that I didn't realize that was the patron saint of this podcast. It's not my favorite.
For many reasons, but Shane Black came up with the title Die Hard.
Yeah.
So
pretty good title.
He's definitely
pretty good title for that
bad.
Shane Black. The Nice Guys, currently on Netflix. Perfect movie in my opinion.
We love you. We love you.
You
Shane.
love you, Shane. Number 2.
This is a little easier, I hope.
I don't know. I'm embarrassed myself. In this category.
That's okay. I feel bad putting you on the spot, but
no, it's fine.
This is for our listeners as well. All right. Can you name all 5 actors who have played Jack Ryan on film and TV?
Alec Baldwin.
Yep.
Harrison Ford.
Yep.
Ben Affleck.
Yep.
Chris Pine.
Yep.
Is the other one on TV? Okay, give me a hint. What does he... Oh, John Krasinski.
Correct.
Thank you.
Well done.
I have not seen much of the late Jack Ryan stuff, but I should definitely check it out. Also, Kenneth Branagh directed it.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Speaking of Shakespeare and Jack Ryan go together like
I love Kenneth Branagh.
Carrot and peas.
Love the guy. Is there any more questions?
I have one more while we're on the casting thing. One more trivia question. Most people know that Harrison Ford was originally approached to play Jack Ryan in The Hunt for Red October before Alec Baldwin eventually bagged the role. But in fact, another all-American movie star was approached to play Ryan even before Harrison Ford. Can you guess who was the producer's first choice for the role of Jack Ryan?
Can I phone a friend?
Yep.
That didn't help. Can you give me a hint? Like a film they were in? Okay.
This very same actor would go on to play Chris Pine's CIA mentor in Jack Ryan: Shadow Recruit.
Oh, I just told you I haven't seen that movie.
Think 1989. Who are the biggest movie stars around? Who is that all-American? I can give you another clue.
Give me another clue.
All right. Mace Neufeld, the producer, also produced a film called No Way Out.
Oh, Kevin Costner.
Yeah, so he was chummy with Costner, and he went to Costner first. But apparently Costner was consumed with his Buffalo movie, to quote Neufeld. No disrespect to Kevin Costner. I think it's good that it ended up Baldwin and Ford. I don't see Costner. There's something a little too Midwestern about him for Jack Ryan, in my opinion, a little bit. He's a little too like of a farm boy. Yeah, I suppose that there's a Costner doesn't necessarily, even though he as a person is an intellectual.
Oh, absolutely.
Doesn't necessarily read on screen as an intellectual. As you say, I think like he plays a lot of like everyman type characters where, Baldwin definitely does. And, Ford has a bit of the rugged, he's kind of both, right? He seems very smart on screen. But it's interesting how certain actors, like Chris Christopherson, for example, is like a Rhodes Scholar, but doesn't read on screen as an intellectual. So, it is an interesting thing.
Well, I was going to say the movie that I think of when I think of Costner in this period is The Untouchables. And he makes a meal out of playing this like kind of nerdy family guy who like literally the iconic line from that movie,
innocent.
It's nice to be married, huh? Yeah. I think to your point, the complexity of this movie, you need a more complicated figure to play the part. You need, even though we don't love the quip, you need a Baldwin who can kind of be like do an impression or like exist
Costner's
in this gray zone.
In this era was very earnest.
Yes.
And Ryan is a little bit more, is maybe a bit of both. So, anyway, I'm sure he would have been great, but...
he does not read as well-heeled from Maine. When Jack Ryan says, I grew up in Maine, I'm like, I know exactly who this guy is. I know guys like that a little bit, and Baldwin is the most successful at feeling like the well-heeled CIA analyst from Maine.
And in the book, it talks about how the fact that Ryan has money and that his wife had money kind of affects some of his choices and his thinking. So he does need to. That's a very astute point.
Yeah, it's just again, you think of Costner as the Buffalo movie guy. Yeah, it's just a different thing. That's really interesting, though. Yeah. No Way Out's a good movie.
Fun fact. Yeah.
No Way Out is a good movie.
Yeah, certainly is.
This movie rules. I don't know what else to say. We have a question here. Where does this film sit in the action movie tradition for you? I mean, it's top 10, top 5?
Wow. Yeah. I think it's historically significant in terms of its place in film history. I think it's like literally a pivotal moment, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, beginning of the techno thriller trend. Yeah. The Simpson Bruckheimer muscular military movies that began, many of them directed by Tony Scott in that era, paves the way for Bourne. And of course, obviously all the Jack Ryan movies. So I think it's a very significant movie in the action film tradition.
And I would say it's not Die Hard. I don't know that any movie is Die Hard, but I certainly rank it very, very high and as close to Die Hard as
agreed.
It's possible.
I love this movie, if that wasn't clear.
I love this movie. It's great. It's so good. Phil, as always.
A pleasure.
Thank you. Good to see you. Good to see you.
I'm just going to get back in my submarine and get back to Glendale.
All right, I'll go look for the FBI guys because we need more of them. Die Hard on a Blank is a podcast hosted and written by Philip Gothhorn. Liam Billingham co-hosts and produces the show. Mike Mayer and Michael Sugar are the executive producers. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at DieHardOAB. Please rate, review, and subscribe and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to Suki Chu and the whole team at Sugar 23. See you next time on Die Hard on a Blank.
Back-to-school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop tax-free August 2nd through 6th and save up to 70% off the latest school styles. The best of apparel, footwear, accessories, and more. Save at Nike Factory Store, American Eagle, Gap Outlet, Crocs, Under Armour, Banana Republic Factory, and hundreds more. There's always something happening. Discover the latest fun and events all season long. Tanger Outlets, your savings destination.